Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an absolute historical thriller centered around Francisco Penzotti. We're looking at a humble 19th century guy whose sheer perseverance, grit, and unwavering faith inadvertently ignited an international movement for religious freedom. We're going to trace exactly how one man, armed with literally nothing but texts and conviction, managed to change the religious landscape of an entire nation. Okay, so let's dive right into this by asking ourselves a pretty high-stakes question based on our source material. What physical comforts would you sacrifice, or what would you risk, just to share your deepest convictions? For most of us today, sharing an idea is as simple as clicking a button on our phones. But for Francisco Penzotti, sharing his beliefs meant risking his freedom, his safety, and quite literally putting his life on the line. Chapter 1. The Making of a Colporteur. This whole incredible journey really begins with his early calling. Born in Italy in 1851, Penzotti actually emigrated with his family to South America when he was still young, eventually putting down roots in Uruguay. And it was there that he became deeply involved in Christian ministry. As a young man, he developed this powerful, driving conviction. He firmly believed that ordinary, everyday people should have direct access to the Bible to hear the gospel for themselves. And that single, unshakable belief, it would dictate the entire rest of his life. Now, you might be looking at that antiquated dictionary term colporteur and wondering what it means. It definitely sounds a bit formal to modern ears, but a colporteur was essentially just a traveling Christian worker who dedicated their life to making the Bible available to regular people. Penzotti completely embraced this demanding ministry because, at his core, he believed that putting a Bible into someone's hands was a real game changer that could alter their entire life. And you have to remember, we're talking about the 19th century here, so the sheer physical toll of this work was immense. Distributing literature didn't mean taking a train or hopping on a flight. He was crossing rugged, remote terrain entirely on foot and by horseback, just moving from town to town. He traveled extensively all throughout South America, reaching folks in isolated villages who had rarely, if ever, encountered Protestant teachings before. Chapter 2. The Mission to Peru. Penzotti's absolute dedication eventually led him to team up with the American Bible Society. This partnership really broadened his reach, and it ultimately brought him face-to-face with his biggest institutional challenge yet when he crossed into Peru. This was a place where Protestant Christianity had very little established presence at the time, and the environment he was walking into was, highly complex to say the least. It created this intense David versus Goliath dynamic. On one side, you had the late 19th century reality of Peru, overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, a place where public Protestant evangelism was viewed with intense suspicion and faced massive institutional pushback. And on the other side, one Protestant colporteur, acting largely on his own, traveling on foot, armed with nothing but a stack of Bibles. But despite those overwhelming odds, he just started distributing his texts and holding religious meetings anyway. And the wild part is, his grassroots, step-by-step formula was actually highly effective. He didn't just hand out a book and walk away. He started with Bible distribution, which naturally led to evangelism, which resulted in discipleship, and finally, church planting. Because he used this structured approach, he successfully helped establish a community of believers who gathered for worship and study, essentially forming one of the earliest organized Protestant congregations in Lima. Chapter 3. 8 Months in Chains. Now, as we so often see in history, when you rock the boat this much, you're going to get some pushback. While his work was generating genuine interest among everyday people, it also triggered fierce institutional opposition. And this rising tension leads us straight to the dramatic climax of our explainer. In 1890, the authorities finally stepped in. They arrested Penzotti in Lima solely for his Protestant religious activities. And they didn't just put him in a standard, run-of-the-mill jail. They threw him into the Casamatas del Callao. We're talking about a notoriously harsh fortress prison in the port of Callao. He was locked up in these absolutely terrible dungeon conditions for approximately 8 grueling months. But look at how he actually responded to this severe hardship. Rather than silencing him, the difficult conditions just couldn't break him. He completely refused to abandon his convictions behind bars. Actually, he basically viewed his imprisonment as simply another opportunity to testify to his faith. He prayed continuously, he read scripture, he encouraged his fellow prisoners, and he maintained an absolute confidence in his beliefs. The thick walls of that fortress literally couldn't contain his mission. Chapter 4. International Outcry and Release. And what happened next is just fascinating. This isolated incident of local persecution inadvertently achieved the exact opposite of its intent.
The authorities were hoping to quietly silence a lone colporteur, but instead, news of his imprisonment leaked far beyond the borders of Peru, sparking a massive international cause célèbre.
Peru's chains spread like wildfire, quickly becoming a global rallying cry. Supporters all across North America and Europe were absolutely outraged. They argued that locking a man in a dungeon simply for distributing Bibles and practicing his faith was a severe violation of the fundamental principles of religious liberty. So instead of silencing Penzotti, those chains drastically increased international awareness of the religious environment in Peru. Tracing the arc of his life here, we can see this incredible journey. Born in 1851, he hits that incredibly dark moment in 1890 inside the Callao dungeon. But because of the mounting international pressure and his own steadfast patience, 1891 marks his celebrated release. Protestant Christians globally rejoiced. And the best part? He didn't quit after that. He expanded his wider Latin American mission, continuing his work with the American Bible Society right up until his death in 1925, leaving behind a truly massive legacy. Chapter 5, A Legacy of Faith. Penzotti left behind a legacy that extended far, far beyond his own generation. The sources make it abundantly clear that his personal suffering fundamentally altered the religious environment of Peru forever. He laid a solid foundation that later Protestant churches would build upon for decades to come. His willingness to suffer directly contributed to several massive, lasting shifts in the region. Because of his time in chains, we see the rapid growth of evangelical Christianity and Protestant congregations. We see drastically increased Bible distribution. And crucially, his case forced a much greater awareness of religious liberty and helped establish lasting Protestant missionary networks throughout the entire region. So, what are the big takeaways from his life? They're pretty profound. First, he showed that his message was worth immense personal sacrifice. Second, a single traveling colporteur proved that texts can cross immense cultural and geographical barriers. Third, and perhaps most surprisingly, institutional suffering doesn't necessarily end a ministry. In Penzotti's case, it actually amplified his cause to the entire world. And finally, his faithfulness went on to influence entire generations that followed. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you reflecting on Penzotti's ultimate lesson. A man with a book walked into a country, faced overwhelming institutional opposition, and was thrown into a fortress dungeon for 8 months. Yet his message only grew louder. Considering everything he endured and the massive legacy he left behind, can human conviction ever truly be silenced by walls or chains? Thanks for joining me to explore the incredible history of Francisco Penzotti.